Well, we've had terrific sessions all day, really, in my opinion, and I hope in yours too. But this is really and truly the climax here, and I'm delighted that we're able to end the 16th conference with this particular session. So all I want to say about it before I turn it over to former Commissioner O'Reilly is that this is going to be the inaugural video cast of Mike's new show called TMT with Mike O'Reilly. I'm very proud that we're going to be hosting that at the Free State Foundation. I'm proud as well that Mike is now an adjunct senior fellow at the Free State Foundation. Many of you that have been here before have heard me say many times how much I appreciated the work that Commissioner O'Reilly did while he was a commissioner, and I was grateful that we were able to collaborate on some of that, and I have great admiration and respect for all of the other commissioners here on the dais. So with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Mike for the TMT with Mike O'Reilly show.
Well, thank you, Randy, and I want to thank you for our partnership. I've certainly enjoyed getting to know you and work with you when I was at the commission, and afterwards since we've done some things together. And this new partnership and this new opportunity, you are all unwilling suspects and part of my new video cast, TMT with Mike O'Reilly. Not every show will look like this. We'll probably have a little different structure as we go forward, a little more intimate, but this is a wonderful opportunity to be back at the Free State Foundation's conference and to be part of a wonderful conversation. I think of the comments by David Letterman in his new show. My fellow guests need no introductions. And that is true. You know their backgrounds, you know them very well. It's great to see Commissioner Clyburn, former acting chair, with us today. Yeah. And we're going to get into some policy and some substance and get in through all of it and then get you out on time is what I've been promised and told to do. Before I do that, I'll make a shameless plug. I have a new piece in the Richmond Times-Dispatch this morning. Take a look, talking about how the BEAD dollars are being handled by the Department of Commerce. I think it's an interesting retrospection of how Congress has handled funding on one side and how the agencies implement things. But maybe that gets us to the agency. Before we get to policy, let's talk about how is the agency operating? When I talk to people on the outside, and I haven't been back since I turned in my BlackBerry, my iPhone on my last.
Oh, BlackBerry's probably.
Yeah. Turned it in, and not a person knew who the hell I was. So that's a fate coming to you all at some point when you turn it in. They don't even know. The day you walk out is the last day they know your name. Yeah. But I haven't been back since then, but I talk to people. They suggest it's been tough because the Zooming and all the different conference calls and everything has made the agency kind of empty. Are you finding that, Commissioner Carr? Are you finding it's a little more different than it was before?
Yeah, well, thanks so much. I mean, a couple things are different. One, we've obviously moved buildings, so it's not only moved buildings, but yeah, there's still sort of a wind down of the COVID era approach, and the chair obviously I think is doing some good work there. At the end of the day, there's a lot of negotiatings with unions inside the building that make it very difficult, but the FCC has still been able to be very productive. Every once in a while, more productive than I would like in certain areas, but as a general matter, they're working really well, and that's good to see.
Commissioner Symington, do you agree? Is it different? Is what you expected in terms of people being mulling around? I mean, I remember when I visited the old facility at 1919 M Street, you could just walk in and there were tons of people everywhere. That's not how I take it is the current.
It's not so much the dynamic. Now, I have what I hope will be the forever unique distinction of being the only commissioner to start remote. So, I was sworn in over Zoom, and well, maybe it was Teams. In any case, so I don't have any experience of the agency to contrast it with. Obviously, people are back now more than they have been prior. Some people are back more than others. But it certainly doesn't feel like the agency has an impeded workflow. It's probably true that there are some intangibles of in-person that are hard to capture with people remote as much as they are. As against that, all of the staff at the commission, I think they take their reputations and the quality of their work very seriously. And they're the kind of people who you can trust to self-manage in this kind of situation. There's some agencies where you can imagine that being pervasively remote might be more of a problem, but I think the FCC's done a great job.
Oh, that's good to hear. So take me through, you now have a full commission. And Commissioner Clyburn and I have been through different formulations with some chairs being empty and then them being full, and you get a full commission, you're doing different things than you may have been doing before. Has it changed your relationship with the current commissioners that you've had and got a chance to know in the minority position that you're in? Commissioner Symington, how's that gone?
Well, I have to say, obviously there are some items where people are just going to be too far apart to ever get to common ground. But on the other hand, I feel like there's been a great opportunity to negotiate for unanimity rather than for 3-2 decisions. And I think the chair values that. And I feel like I've been very, very busy the last few days negotiating things for the upcoming meeting. So that's my current experience, that there's still a lot of give and take, there's a lot of different perspectives, and there's a lot of thought that goes into everything. An item that passes 5-0 might have been very actively negotiated behind the scenes. And I think when we look at the unanimity of both the 4-0 and now the 5-0 votes, in a lot of cases, the kind of discussions that are happening behind the scenes in both of those are very similar. So I would say it's a very solid working relationship. We had a lot of time to get to know each other, and of course, Commissioner Gomez was extremely well known to the telecom world before she joined the commission and had lots of prior senior experience in government. So it's been very smooth.
Yeah, look, I think as you two know better than most, the relationships among majority and minority at the FCC is more often marked like oil and water than a well-oiled machine. But something very unique is happening at the FCC right now, and it's because we had this sort of unique period of time in which the agency was 2-2, where we had to come together, we had to find common ground. I think that built a muscle of working together that is different than what we've seen before. For instance, when I was a legal advisor to a commissioner in the minority, I remember negotiating, like literally moving a comma in an item, and succeeding in moving the comma was such a big deal that I printed the document out and framed it as look, nothing is impossible. We got a comma moved. And so right now—
That wasn't my office, was it?
No. Right now things are a little different, a little better than that. I mean, as the commissioner noted, obviously there's going to be tough issues. We'll have some of them next month. We'll have actually probably some of them this week as well. We'll see.
Commissioner Clyburn, we had policy disputes when I was there.
We did.
How did
Let's rehash them right now.
I think everybody knows.
did policy disputes ever affect personnel relationships?
I'll tell the truth. Well, number one, it's good to be here. And secondly, Mike knows more than most that I'm pretty direct and transparent. So that's the hint at the answer to that question. Look, we're fundamentally different. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that on key issues that we feel strongly about, we might, go in separate corners. But we don't stay there. And see, that's the thing about it. And Mike knows more, and Mike has experience with me, for real, really. And, I was just direct. I was like, Mike, I need a timeout. I said it just like that, and I'll let you know when it's okay to speak to me. I mean, it was really that direct, but it was never permanent. And he knew it wasn't permanent. He knew that the issues that we just got, just emotionally involved in the issue, and those things happen. But what ultimately happens is you move from that, because the greater good and what you're charged to do really is more important than any type of temporary disagreement that you have. So we were grown-ups about it. It took me a minute to grow up.
Three weeks?
Yeah. Was it 3 weeks? I told him it was going to be a couple of months, so I did pretty good, when it comes to that. But, you just, I think it's just important to recognize that, to express it, and to not get to the point where it's so personal that you can't move forward. And it never got that.
That's right. Let's talk about priorities. When you're a commissioner, you get to try and push certain things. We're not chair here, but you get to pick particular issues of interest to you. Commissioner Carr, what are you spending your time on these days?
I think one of the most important things right now going on at the FCC has to do with spectrum. This is one, Mike, where probably better than others, the amount of sweat and blood and tears that goes into actually making progress on these issues. And I'm deeply concerned about where we are right now on spectrum policy in the US. So just today, in fact, the administration announced a spectrum implementation plan. And for those that aren't steeped in this, last year, the Biden administration released a broader document called a National Spectrum Strategy. And it's important to remember that when that strategy was released, we were at a point in time in which we were falling behind other countries in the availability of spectrum. We've now fallen about 300 megahertz on average behind our other global allies, and we're on track to fall 700 megahertz behind China, particularly when you're focused, these numbers here, on licensed mid-band spectrum. So that national spectrum strategy from last year was coming in at a key point when things were getting away from us as a country. And again, spectrum is key to geopolitical leadership, it's key to economic growth, national security. So this key element, we were slipping behind. And that national spectrum strategy committed to freeing up exactly 0 megahertz of spectrum. And it was a real miss. What they were telling us back then is that they were just going to kick the can down the road. Now today, the new implementing plan came out, and it confirmed that yes, the administration is simply going to kick the can down the road. There's no commitment in there to freeing up spectrum in the near term. This isn't easy. I mean, again, you can look at the work that Commissioner O'Reilly did to put forward, whether it was the 2.5 we worked on, the C-band that we worked on. These are tough things, so I don't mean to dismiss that. But the reality is we are falling, as an administration, into a deep malaise when it comes to one of the most important features of economic growth, which is spectrum. We've got to get back on track. There's actually some good bills that would do this. So Senator Cruz, Senator Thune, and Senator Blackburn just this week introduced a really smart bill that is an actual spectrum plan and implementation strategy. That's the path forward that we need to track, but the current administration approach is one where we're off course.
Commissioner Symington, what's monopolizing your time?
Sure, absolutely. So I'll just name a couple of issues and then focus on one other. There's definitely stuff for us to do on orbital debris, particularly for market access licensees to put American domestic licensees on parity with them. There are things that we should also be looking at in terms of improving receiver quality, because if we're going to reclaim potentially greenfield spectrum, that's one mechanism of doing that. But maybe the most interesting thing for me right now is the potential for the FCC to coordinate with other agencies as well on cybersecurity issues. Now, that's a hot topic at the FCC, a sensitive one, because it's easy for the agency to burn its fingers trying to actually do substantive cybersecurity. We're not built for it. But on the other hand, the border between hardware and firmware has become a little bit porous recently. So we've seen, for example, rumblings about Swiss Army knife style signal generation devices, signal listening devices being used for signal hacking purposes. And if anyone's responsible for addressing the question of signal hacking and what it would mean to have a device that can move from being a conforming device to being a non-conforming device, that's probably an FCC issue. There's probably no one else within the IT stack that's at that particular level that has that jurisdiction in cybersecurity. So fortunately, it should be a meeting item this week that is, I think, taking really good steps in that direction and probably provision to do something further.
You know, I'll chime in and say that one of the things that really brought this home for me is my service on the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And what you say, I'll argue with you a little later, but what I'm not going to argue about is that it is vital that we get this right. We should not be looking at this particular issue as, you know, government versus commercial, or, you know, that kind of narrow old. When we came into it, it was seemingly sort of a tug of war between commercial interests and national security. You know, those lines need to rightfully be blurred. In China should be a big part of the impetus, and so. I'm not going to debate whether or not the current administration is getting it, you know, 100% what administration does. But it is definitely imperative. It's a part of the trifecta of importance in terms of economic strength, technological innovation, and, you know, commercial vitality. So it's really important where things need improvement, that we really continue you know, to make those points and to ensure that those who are of influence are paying the proper level of attention to this critical issue. We cannot afford to continue to fall behind. We are falling behind. Others are very laser focused, here for reasons that don't necessarily align with our national security interests. I agree to a point, it is just a necessary focal point for us, and we need to continue to get it more right.
Okay, well, a couple you mentioned spectrum and receiver standards as it pertains to spectrum. We'll come back to your AI.
Okay.
I think many people would suggest that I have some artificial intelligence inserted into me. So, but to your point, see,
Oh my gosh, I just went artificially intelligent, but okay, but please continue.
So let's go back to spectrum. Obviously, they're trying to legislate on a spectrum pipeline bill, but can the agency move, spectrum pipeline without Congress? I know I certainly worked hard to try and do a number of bands without Congress. I always love congressional involvement. I think of what the commission has before. It's got 12 gigahertz is sitting there to reallocate for certain purposes. It would be something I've advocated for. Certainly not trying to weigh into your activities, but it does beg the question: when are we going? What can the commission do itself, and what's the holdup? Any thoughts on that?
It's a good question because, yes, our spectrum auction authority has lapsed, so we can't actively auction spectrum, but there is a lot more forward momentum that we can show at the FCC on spectrum. You noted 12 gigahertz. I haven't gotten sort of a final opinion on that one, but at the end of the day, my macro there is I'm open to getting a win-win. Obviously, we can do more in that spectrum band that I'm all for doing that. I want to look at some additional of the technical issues, but also there's more we can do on license, for instance. Again, I think in the main, where a real deficit is in licensed midband, but given we can't auction spectrum, there is still some stuff we can do on unlicensed. I've identified some bands, including Uni 2C as a band that we could look at to potentially free up some more. But I also think the FCC could do a better job of articulating clearly to Congress, here's a spectrum calendar. Here's a spectrum calendar that if we had our auction authority, we'd do this band here, this band there. That's what I put out in 2021, but it's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem right now with Congress, where there's a lack of energy apparently for re-auctioning our authority. I think we need to speak more clearly as an agency and tell them, here's what's missing, here's what we would do with it. So I think yes, the pipeline that Congress is doing is great, as I've applauded it, but we ourselves as an FCC should put out a spectrum plan as well.
Mr. Symington, I remember Blair Levin just a little bit ago said the agency doesn't have a lot go, even if it did have auction authority. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you can see the benefit of Congress stepping in at this point, because that simplifies the interagency questions once Congress, which is higher authority than agencies, provides a forceful resolution to those. And I think there's clearly a sense that there are some bands that are not that don't have a realistic chance of becoming available for commercial use, particularly on full power exclusive use licenses, through any other path. But it's also true that the commission should have its own theory of what a spectrum pipeline should look like. Otherwise, we're making Congress do all of our work. And dealing with 12 gigahertz in particular, I'm keeping an open mind on that one as well. I guess I would note that a proposed use in fixed wireless instead of wireless mobility starts to address some of the specific technical problems about side lobes swamping individual antenna elements in area antennas that I raised in my statement on the 12 gigahertz use in mobility context. And so with fixed, you're looking at a totally different network engineering scenario. On the other hand, the federal government as a whole has not treated fixed with particular care recently. It's not a policy focus, so maybe that would be one way of getting some attention back on it. I would also, I guess, note that when we're talking about fixed for these kinds of deployments, we should also be careful that we're not just focusing on pure raw line speed or even certain latency calculations, but we should be looking at the totality of it, including firmware on the consumer side, which is often where you see a practical bottleneck in attenuation of quality of service. So getting more network engineering eyes on what this looks like would be good too. In terms of, you mentioned receiver standards. I always have to be careful because I started saying receiver standards and then people start worrying that the commission is actually going to try and dictate the physical design composition of receivers, something like that. I think what the term I'm trying to go more with is receiver performance. So looking at metrics under which the commission could assess receiver performance or could just obtain even very rough measures of spectral efficiency in different services is, I think, part of the path towards asking some of the same questions that we did in the AWS 3 and AWS 1 auctions, namely, are the incumbent services really efficient compared to a possible commercial use? And if not, how do we get to yes on this in a mutually beneficial way? Obviously, no one wants to give up equities, but on the other hand, if, for example, there were money available to move people off of dedicated spectrum and onto more generic spectrum without loss of quality of service, or as we saw frequently when the Fed agencies upgraded in AWS 3 and 1, with significant gains in maintainability, power consumption, security, et cetera. If it's possible to do that, then really it's just a matter of finding the activation energy to identify those candidates and move them.
I think the days are going to continue to push the agency to be more efficient. What about unused spectrum? What can we do, to push the envelope until the political powers that come to their spectral senses? And so, again, you guys are speaking about what you can do in the meantime and the examples and the things to put forth that would continue to fuel and stimulate and do the types of things that we're, the goals that we are attempting to achieve. I think the FCC will do it a lot of, in the meantime, continue to do the in the meantime work to be turnkey ready when those political forces align themselves.
All right, last spectrum question. Commissioner Carr, you mentioned the spectrum strategy. Do you have any engagement with this administration on their current proposal as they plow through and move forward? And to former Commissioner Clyburn's point, do we have enough spectrum as we get to 6G and spectrum that's going to be relevant for things, the advanced applications of AI and all the new technology that she's working on?
Well, to the question whether I've engaged a lot with the administration over spectrum, I would say yes in one sense. It's been one way. I've offered my views through press releases and they've ignored them. That's basically the contours of my relationships with them. And look, there is some really good work that they're doing, particularly on some of the process reform stuff. But again, as the bottom line, we're just not going fast enough to turn the corner back to where we need to be to hit the same pace and cadence on spectrum that we were moving on from 2017 to 2020. I mean, again, during that period of time with Commissioner O'Reilly, we were there moving 6,000 megahertz of licensed spectrum, thousands of megahertz in addition of unlicensed. And the administration right now is, looking to study, not even move, but study about a quarter of that on the license side. So it's concerning. But I do think, again, we can take a look at really focusing in on, is there a path forward on lower 3? Is there a path forward on 7/8? Is there a path forward on 12? Those are some of the spectrum bands that I'd be focused on.
But I remain hopeful.
Yes.
That the collaboration that is necessary and that exists, that it will get better. Comments like the ones today are heard. And again, where there's an opportunity for things to be, maybe focused on in a different way. We're not speaking in vacuums, so that's why I remain hopeful.
Mr. Symington, is Alan Davidson or Secretary Armando, you get into chat often about what?
They're on speed dial.
Yeah. To turn to your question about 6G and AI specifically, it's probably true that although it's easier to do network engineering on a fully exclusive and full power basis, if we still have a significant 5G installed base at the time that we transition to 6G, which of course we will, then the question quickly becomes: is there actually practically enough spectrum to service both the incumbent services, which are now heavily relied upon, and the new ones? And so, of necessity, there's people are continuing to look at shared. As we look at shared, I think it makes sense, particularly with very high frequencies, to start asking the question of whether a contour map is actually an adequate model for millimeter wave and above. 3D mapping, particularly for deployments in cities, is probably going to become increasingly relevant as you wind up having adaptive antennas on either end engaging in real-time pathing and opportunistic frequency selection, which is probably going to be AI powered. So to the extent that that's where the commission's model is evolving, the 2D contour map with the implication that being that everyone has that everyone has exclusive use to particular frequencies on a 2D surface just becomes increasingly irrelevant. You might have a street level user, for example, at 37 gig that's operating a different service from the users above treetops. So, for example, you could have it being used for traffic control at street level, and you could be having it used for wireless ISPs at above the 10th story. That kind of thing is increasingly going to coexist. So, in addition to the frequency and timing aspects of sharing, we're going to have to start thinking about geographical separations on different structures, as well as what it even means to have rights in frequency when part of the proposition is constant frequency hopping.
Okay. Well, let's turn to a little bit more controversy issues that are out there. The last panel didn't want to really talk about net neutrality, or 2 panels ago didn't want to talk about net neutrality, but maybe we can get to what is your expectation on timing, and then also maybe what is your views on the shift of the paradigm for the underlying item itself. Are we expecting an item soon? And the commission obviously did a 180, or I would call it a 180 in terms of justification. What are your thoughts in that universe? You want to start at the end and we'll come down?
Sure. Well, since I know the least, I'll start first.
You start at this end and we'll come down?
In terms of timetable, I'll say I think it's sooner rather than later. There's a lot of filing going on from what I've been told and what I can see. This is clearly a priority and an important issue for the chairwoman. So I'm looking for movement, and contradict me if you would, because it would be fun to volley, but perhaps in the May-June timeframe. So I say sooner rather than later that we're going to get moving. It is obvious. Again, it's an election year, so things will continue, to happen. I think in that direction. It is a priority. Obviously a priority, one of the first things that, out of the gate. So,
were you surprised that the justifications that you spent so much time on kind of were not the focus of this item?
Well, one of the things that we need to take note of, and this is an evolving ecosystem. And so some of the things that we relied on in the past, where I was, when I was there, those things have changed. But the fundamental, premise of doing what we are able to do with the new and emerging players in this broadband-enabled, ecosystem, that is important that there are protections, there are expectations laid forth, and that, whatever means that we need to discover and explore are put in place, and this proper regulatory signals that are sent to protect those who use the services, that they are put in place and obvious for those who, from hospitals to, whoever the providers of, these platforms, that the goals are aligned. So, I'm not surprised, and it's not your Janikowski or Wheeler, order, and it should not be.
Shankar, what do you think?
Well, look, net neutrality is probably one of the greatest branding episodes we've ever seen in tech policy. I'm not mad about that. Kudos to Tim Wu for coining the phrase, but it is also one of the most interesting sleights of hand that we've seen in the regulatory context. Again, 2 very different things. Net neutrality rules, no blocking, no throttling, no unreasonable discrimination. And then Title II, which is really what this is all about, which is about these heavy-handed 1930s era regulations that go all the way down to regulating price controls. That's really what Title II is about. And the American people were told back in 2017, when we were on the commission and worked together to repeal President Obama's original decision to go down that path of Title II for the first time, and people were subjected to the most outrageous Chicken Little claims about what would happen from our decision. We were told it was literally, CNN headline, the end of the internet as we know it. We were told the internet would slow down. You have to start paying by the word for websites. People said that, things like Justin Bieber would never be discovered because he relied on YouTube and videos. And I wasn't sure if that was an argument for or against net neutrality. I couldn't really parse it. Commissioner Clyburn loves to tell this story. You know, I had a Facebook message that came in from a high school ex-girlfriend, and she said that in repealing Title II, I was about to make the second biggest mistake of my life, and I can assure you that neither of those decisions were mistakes. But what did we see? You know, prices have come down, competition has increased, Americans have been brought across the digital divide, speeds are up 5- and 6-fold. We had COVID hit, where everyone went online virtually overnight, massive spike in traffic, taking a year's worth of traffic growth and stacking it on the internet overnight. And in America, our networks continue to hum because we had that right, light touch, pro-investment framework. In Europe, which has a regime that looks a lot more like Title II, their speeds went down. Their regulators called up Netflix and asked them to degrade the quality of the service because they were afraid that the continent's networks were going to break. So flash forward, finally, to your question. Why all of a sudden have we sort of switched out, Lucy with the football, new justification? Because, you know, there's an old saying about, you know, well.
It's so old.
It's so old, right? I'm struggling with it at this point. But look, the old justification we put out there has been clearly exposed to be not true. So you can't just simply run the same play again and expect people to buy it. And so this time we're being told we need to do the exact same thing, but now the reason is national security. But that argument doesn't withstand scrutiny either. There's absolutely nothing in the item that identifies a national security threat that Title II would address. In fact, the one sort of issue that it talks expressly about is an issue that wouldn't be subject to Title II regulation in any event, even if we reclassified. CALEA applies to broadband, our outage reports apply to broadband. We have national security agencies that have a lot of authority in this space. So it was really surprising to me to learn for the first time that there's some lurking national security threat that's been sitting in our networks for 6 years. We haven't heard about it, we haven't talked about it, we haven't gone to Congress to get authority to resolve it. So long story short, I'm not entirely persuaded by the national security justification.
The reason why we arm wrestle a lot, honestly, is because I say these conversations in this particular direction, when we talk about the next iteration of net neutrality standards, we would not have all of these non-emergency or to your adopting your phrase, not necessarily needed positions or actions by the FCC at this point. I say some of the things that are not happening because of threat of something else happening. So you cannot say that this evolution or this phase of net neutrality standards that would be before us maybe May or June, you cannot say that what happened before under the first two iterations was not an influence over people being more more cautious or behaving themselves because the threat of or that those standards were laid before. I said that real long to say, look, if somebody's watching, you're going to behave yourself. If nobody's watching, if we have this existing de facto net neutrality environment, you're going to go to whatever your natural or your normal is. And I say that is my support, and that's the reason why I support clear rules with an agency which you can point to that would be, that place where the protections are. And so that's...
Slight difference, okay.
It's like the
Commissioner
first court, is that what you said?
A slight difference. Commissioner Symington, what's your expectation on timing and the new justifications, and what's your viewpoint?
Yeah, sure. So I think I agree with former Commissioner Clyburn that we're going to see action pretty quickly because otherwise there's potential CRA problems. So obviously the chairwoman is much more secure against CRA once there's a final order. So in terms of changing justifications, well, if you go back and read the original 2003, I think it is, Tim Wu paper on net neutrality, what he's saying is that you should not have dedicated protocols and that you should instead be using general purpose protocols. You shouldn't have application preferences. Instead, each application should be free to use the internet on a basis of equality. when he's talking about applications, he doesn't mean Facebook or something which didn't exist yet. He means desktop applications. He means like Microsoft Word shouldn't be a second-class citizen if it wants to send an email, or likewise your browser shouldn't have to use whatever protocols your ISP wants you to use, but should be able to use any generally available internet protocols to handle things. So as far as has this been achieved? Yeah, it's been achieved a long time ago. There's that kind of net neutrality, as Commissioner Carr said, is just a done deal. It's a baseline consumer expectation. If you look back at the world of 2003, it wouldn't have seemed impossible. Here, hands up anyone who had a CompuServe account, America Online, Genie, The Well, anyone? Right.
AOL, maybe.
AOL, okay, fair enough. But we had a plethora of online services at the time, very diverse. Prodigy's another one. You've got to think about Prodigy and CompuServe when you're doing 230 stuff. But with all of these, you weren't on the internet. You were on a network, and the internet is a network of networks. And the idea that you're going to have traffic that's portable across a cable network and a phone system and across a satellite and all that on a common basis of TCP/IP. Again, that's a baseline expectation. The idea that at some point someone was going to attempt to recreate the closed proprietary networks of the CompuServe and Prodigy and other online service era, that might have been a real fear at one point, but I think that's way in the rearview mirror. I don't think ISPs, even if they wanted to do it, would have a path to acceptance from consumers, and I don't think that they've been seriously planning to monetize anything like that for a very, very long time. So we're sort of protecting against something that has just ceased to be viable market practice. As far as national security justifications specifically, the FCC is a small agency, right? We're about 1,600 people. We didn't grow with this year's budget. 1,600 is really not that much compared to other agencies. I believe AG has 100,000 employees. And I think within various agencies at Commerce, it totals up to about 60,000.
They do our payroll, I think, for us.
Right, exactly, right, yeah, right, exactly, right. So, and I'm not saying that those staff aren't necessary or something, but people often say things like telecom is 1/6 of the national economy in the United States. If I take that at face value, 1,600 people to regulate the entire thing is, it's not that much. And part of that is that it sort of precludes us from being experts in everything. I said the FCC has burned its fingers on cybersecurity before. I think the FCC would also most likely burn its fingers trying to do national security outside of interagency coordination. But we probably shouldn't have an independent national security policy. And there are plenty of organs within the federal government already. I mean, if you can put something through CFIUS review, I don't know what we're really adding on that front or what special enabling power CFIUS or Team Telecom or whoever wished they had. That's only a gap that's filled by Title II. And so I guess maybe just on this last point here, one of the longstanding justifications for Title II that I haven't heard mentioned on the dais because, again, much of the history tends to recede into the background, is the concept of natural local monopolies. Now that we've got multimodal high-performance internet, that becomes increasingly irrelevant, where you might have fixed wireless builds that are as fast as fiber, or where you might have a Starlink build that's as fast as fiber, or something similar. So if there are now so many modes of connection, some of which are not particularly geographically bound, that we're no longer talking about monopoly, the natural monopoly argument in the same way that we would for example, power generation or something like that, then again, the Title II arguments become increasingly inapposite. Obviously, common carriage doesn't require that per se, but it's a long-standing justification was clearly where people were thinking for a long time.
Well, one area that Commissioner Clyburn and I agreed on in the past, and if we are going to have these rules, that it should have some type of, there should be national rules and not have 57 different standards. Do you still agree with that position? And then, commissioners, do you agree that, or maybe your viewpoint of whether it should be, if a policy is to go forward, should it be a floor or a ceiling to allow states to add to as they see fit?
So I'm going to take a more nuanced approach today. And saying, I'll say this on the one hand, it is definitely easier to have a single standard than the potentially 57 standards, across the nation. I get that. But here's part of the challenge. As we all know, there are some states that move forward. And there are some states that passed and ratified, rules and laws.
Doesn't make it right.
I'm not taking a position. I said nuance. I use the word nuance. Witnesses. And some of those, rules and laws go beyond, what you have before you for consideration. So, how do we balance and challenge that? There are people who are relying on those rules and those interpretations locally and from a state perspective. How do we move in, how do we make shifts there? So these are the things. So I'm not going to say that I've changed. I'm just going to say that I'm going to be more nuanced with my answer today and acknowledge from a managerial perspective that, one is easier to manage than potentially 57, which it won't ever get to 57, but potentially. That even if things were to shift in that particular direction, it will not be an easy shift.
Gentlemen?
Yeah, look, I think, some people, I think, particularly in industry, when they saw some of the original proposals from the FCC, whether it was Title II or digital equity, they saw, well, the silver lining here is there's very strong preemption language, but lo and behold, the strong preemption language didn't say strong, even up to the FCC vote. It got watered down. And so that's sort of concerning that we ended up in a position where, to your point, we could have, intrusive federal regulation and then sort of, slightly different, but also intrusive state regulation. And so I think it's concerning from that perspective. But ultimately, with net neutrality, with Title II in particular, any effort the FCC does to get that across the finish line will be exceptionally short-lived. I mean, one of the significant things that has changed since 2017 and since 2015 and 2016, when we last had Title II, is the Supreme Court precedent that applies to agency actions. West Virginia versus EPA obviously was a big piece of that. And they're taking a hard look at the major questions doctrine. If there ever was a major question, it certainly would be the debate that we've had for 20 or 30 years over Title II. So whatever win is had at the FCC on Title II will simply be pretty good news for lawyers, but ultimately will not be a long-standing FCC decision.
Mr. Symington?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in another legal life, I worked as a lawyer for financing the trusts that finance consumer assets like cars. So if you're Ford or GM or Honda or whatever, you may have a captive finance arm, but you're going to sell those into lending trusts, and so you have to think hard in order to keep rolling your capital over about what the local consumer lending laws are. So 57 jurisdictions, that's absolutely something that I've lived. I sat down at one point and enumerated all the agencies that we had to comply with in addition to every local jurisdiction, and I think I got up to 14. And then there are even some sub-state jurisdictions. New York City in particular is generally carved out of auto leasing trusts because they have different auto leasing rules that aren't generally applicable to the rest of the country. So what I'm saying is I've done this kind of stuff, and it's no fun. It's not just that it's no fun, but it's highly frictional. If there's ever a case for obvious field preemption, this is one of them. And if we don't get to field preemption, instead we treat it as a floor, then we're inviting a single state or even a single judge in a single state to potentially disrupt network engineering over the entire country, and it's not clear to me what the gain from that is. I remember all the way back in the bar exam, I had a bar hypo that related to whether Congress could field preempt tobacco auctions, and the conclusion was yes. So if we can do that, we can probably preempt on broadband regulation and get to national uniformity on that front, especially because obviously broadband traffic is inherently both national and international, and so having a different compliance regime in every jurisdiction is sort of bad.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about media and media potential deals. I won't put any before you, no hypotheticals. Mm-hmm. But what I kind of took away from this, the TEGNA Standard General, was a commission saying, don't bring any media deals forward. Don't bother. It's not worth your time. You're not going to get a favorable viewpoint. I get asked a ton of times by many folks, could the commission approve a combination of larger media outlets, whether it be cable and cable, broadcast and broadcast, others as well, or some combination of therein, maybe two satellite companies perhaps, two DBS companies. Is there anything you could see in the remaining of this year, you could see anything, or maybe whatever happens after the election?
Yeah, I think it's difficult if you look at the clock and how long it takes the FCC to review at least significant mergers. And if a significant one coming in and getting approved, before the election. I think the clock is fairly tight on that when you look at just the numbers. Stepping back as a macro matter, I do think there are obviously very significant headwinds right now to any sort of transaction across the board with the government, principally, what you see coming out of the Federal Trade Commission. The FCC, Standard General Tegna was a bit of a head scratcher to me. I don't know personally whether to read it as part of a broader, closed for business approach that we're seeing across the government, or I've seen some people try to purple cow that one. I'm not sure exactly what type of cow that results in, but people point to the fact that there were some concerns about, hedge funds being involved, which I'm not sure if that's a right or wrong one, but some people try to purple cow and say if you're not a hedge fund, you might have a better shot than Standard General Tegna. I've seen people say that there's strong union opposition to that one. If you can avoid that, you're not in as rough shape. And then you had, pretty high level political pushback as well. I believe both former Speaker Pelosi and I think maybe Elizabeth Warren, Senator Warren, also sort of pushed back. And so some people have said, well, don't read too much into that one as sort of a broader representation of headwinds on transactions. Read it as, you need to avoid those sort of secrets of the fire swamp. I don't know. I don't know what the truth is, but again, needless to say, there are a lot of headwinds right now sort of for any transaction.
Commissioner Symington, do you think the commission's open to something if it's put before you, or is it like, don't bother?
Well, could the commission approve something? Sure. But is it likely? I don't think anyone would take that impression away after reading the quad and looking at the likely impact on smaller M&A. I don't think anyone would take that impression away after seeing us dust off Section 632. I don't think that there's any signal that the commission has given right now that either that forward-looking M&A is going to proceed either quickly or with certainty, on the one hand, or on the other, that retrospective M&A is even secure. So right now, certainly my impression from talking to our media regulatees is that they feel a little bit alarmed. I'm going to just take a moment to mention that when I'm talking about small market M&A, there are huge numbers of stations. There's a generational dynamic in everything. There are huge numbers of smaller stations or smaller groups where the founder, frankly, is looking to exit. And very often these are rural, and these are disproportionately minority-owned stations. So in these cases, finding financing to do this is tough enough because, of course, you can't finance a license. It may maybe be interesting for the commission to explore carve-outs to the no security interest in licenses policy. That's for another day. But if you can't either borrow against your biggest asset or even obtain certainty of closing a transaction, I'm not sure what these folks are supposed to do. It's a holding pattern as the licenses depreciate, most likely due to lack of ability to reinvest, and just due to it being harder to operate a business when you're 80 years old than when you're 60 or 40. Although some people manage very well, but
Don't know where you're going with that one.
My point is we can't really just ask people to own media assets forever. At a certain point, there needs to be a path out of them, and it's not clear what that path is. And I think the communities that are affected, we tend to focus on the top 50 DMAs, but we sort of need to look at the others and ask what's the future media ownership in this community, or does it have one?
So I know you think I'm not going to say anything about this, but I am. Full disclosure, I did have an interest in that particular transaction that you recommended. And I will say the obvious, the FCC's composition, its regulatory framework, and its commitment to the public interest, how that's perceived is definitely going to play a critical role in, any type of consideration or evaluation of any transaction coming forward. But, as I lick my wounds, I will say that a lot of us learned, and hopefully the agency learned, each transaction should, whether up or down, it really forces us, if we're smart, to improve the process.
I love it. Process reform, this is great.
Again, transparency. That is much needed in any transaction process. Clear communication, disclosure of terms, and timely updates are essential. Efficiency, there needs to be continue to be a streamlining of administrative steps to reduce paperwork and delays. Yes, we have to have risk assessments. Yes, there's a need for regulatory compliance and stakeholder engagement. But I am hopeful that all of us learn from this process. I never, regardless of how I voted, never took anything off the table. When it comes, if it's in the public interest, no matter what, it was going to get, consideration from me. Again, I hope we all learn from this process and we'll, continue to grow.
Okay. All right, let's do one last substantive matter, and then we can do some lighthearted conversation. We have one topic that's been brought up before this audience, a number of panels before, but the digital discrimination item. I'm captivated by when I read it in terms of its scope, and where the commission is, who can be covered by the universe, and then I'm also captivated by what data you could present and what magical universe you could present to the commission, and what who they're going to deputize to do certain things. What's your viewpoint? We'll start on the far end this time. We'll come back. Is that okay?
Sure. So the digital discrimination item, I got to say, it's very broad. In fact, it's not clear to me where its authority, where its purported authority runs out, and it's also not clear to me to what degree it's anyone could argue that they've successfully satisfied the requirements. It seems like it's very vague. It's a vague standard. Maybe you could say, if this would definitely destroy my business, I can't do it. But on the other hand, it's always feasible to make less money. And I really don't know what it means. I don't, as a corporate finance guy, I'm not sure what I would do if I'm in-house and my boss asks me, will this clear our internal hurdle rate of, say, of 20%, because we have a cost of capital and that's what we need to make to justify a project and taking on the risk. Maybe a higher cost of capital in today's interest rate environment. We've got a cost of capital. Does it pass our internal hurdle rate? And I would have to say, I really don't know. The error bars around the risk on this thing are so big, I can only talk about it in qualitative terms. So it would be sort of a sad irony if the effect of this is to make everyone really, really unwilling to enter new developments. And that would be stymieing the very communities that this is purported to be helping. So, but I'm very much worried that if I put on my corporate planner hat and imagine myself stepping back into the private sector, that's what I would have to tell my boss or my board. So, and in terms of what the standards are, I guess I'm taking some solace in that. I think it's unlikely to survive judicial review ultimately. But on the other hand, if it takes a long time for that question to come up, and in the meantime, operating companies feel that they have to play along so that they don't attract enforcement under unclear standards, well, then that could do a great deal of mischief before someone finally feels wounded enough to take it to judicial review and raise what I think are numerous constitutional problems with the item.
Fair. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm deeply concerned, obviously, by the FCC's digital equity proceeding. It asserts jurisdiction for the first time in the FCC's 80-year history over entire industries that have never been regulated by the FCC. We're talking everything from, financing to advertising, let alone construction crews, all the way down. Second, it sweeps in almost every single type of service and offering by all of those new entities that have been swept into the FCC's regulation. It's a type of depth and thoroughness of regulation that we really haven't seen since the 1930s, when you basically had Ma Bell and the government mostly operating as one in the same. And I think more broadly, it reflects a shift in regulatory philosophy. It used to be, I think there was broad bipartisan consensus that when market forces are driving good outcomes, like let's let those market forces continue to drive the good outcomes. But now it seems that there's a perception among some that unless the government is mandating and almost sitting at the board of companies to direct specific outcomes, it's not good enough. And so I think this is an example of that broader trend we have to turn back from. And again, some people can look at digital equity and say, hey, it's no big deal, it's just one thing, but it's digital equity, it's Title II. And you step back, you start to look at the really frothy competitiveness that we have in the internet sector right now, in the ISP sector, and there's some warning signs there. If you look to Europe, for instance, we got to remember that we need these networks to be magnets for massive amounts of capital investment. When we go brick by brick by brick by brick to create all of these disincentives, all of a sudden those bricks start to really add up, and maybe we start to get investment levels that look like Europe, which resulted, again, in networks that really weren't that great during the surge in COVID traffic. And it's also interesting to me that digital equity came from a one-page provision of law tucked in a 1,000-page infrastructure act. And if you could read all the intrusive regulations into that one page, well, then we should just save the trees and get rid of the Communications Act, because one page produced something that is more intrusive in a lot of ways, I think, than Title II. And in fact, Title II makes Title II regulation of the internet look almost like an act of regulatory humility in comparison.
Look, your boss, Congress, told you, tasked the FCC to, and I quote, prevent digital discrimination of access based on income level, race, ethnicity, color, religion, or national origin, regardless of what page it's on. It tasks you to do that. So it is my opinion that, and I've heard both of you say it, I don't tell what Congress what to do, the Congress tells me to do. And so how it is interpreted and implemented, that's subject obviously for debate, but this was a congressional will. The agency had to enact rules under section 60506 and to make a finding. And so the agency has made it clear that it's not looking at past behaviors of ISPs. These rules will be forward-looking. So whether agree or not, you were tasked to do this, and the chair complied.
Okay, all right, we got 1 minute left. These are lightning round, quick questions. Just pick one or the other. No,
Okay.
no wrong answer necessarily. Let's start with the first one. Would you rather be a congressperson or FCC chair?
FCC chair.
I don't have the hairline for electoral politics, so I'm gonna be happy with this job right here.
That wasn't the question.
Yeah, I'll take the chair.
Okay, interesting. What's a bigger loss to you, your TV remote or your cell phone?
Cell phone.
Yeah, definitely the phone.
Phone.
Okay, interesting. And would you rather visit China or Russia?
Well, I've been to both, actually.
Okay, which is your favorite?
Picking favorites between them.
That wasn't the question, the original question.
I'm pretty confident I wouldn't be allowed into China right now, so that might narrow it down.
I'd be interested in perpetrating some industrial espionage. China seems like the best place to do that.
Well, can everyone thank my guest?
That was a joke for the record.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, commissioners. I think ambassadors, they say when you're an ambassador, then you have that title for life. Well, I abide by the same rule with commissioners. So thank you all, commissioners present and former. And Commissioner Symington, I actually represented CompuServe for about 15 years when I was in private practice, and I love the way you mentioned CompuServe there. So finally, we're wrapping up, and I just want to say that, it's my opinion, but I bet you share it. We've had so much wonderful content here today, and so much important content that I think it will give us a lot to consider and reflect upon in the coming months, and in some cases, maybe the coming years. And this session here today was certainly a wonderful climax to what I think was a terrific conference. So, so many times during the day, I just looked around, and that was true at this session. You could hear a pin drop. I dropped a couple myself just to test, and that's how much attention was paid. So thank all of you for coming. Thank you, you guys again. And next year, I expect about this time, I'll be saying, wow, I can't believe it's the 17th Annual Free State Foundation Conference. So thanks to all of you for coming.